Assalamu alaikum. How are you guys? I hope you are in good health. In the first video we talked about Thomson's model. We said according to Thomson, atom is a positive sphere with electrons, negative electrons distributed like watermelon seeds distributed inside the watermelon. Now we talked also about a question which said who proved that Thomson was wrong. The scientist's name was Hans Geiger and Ernest Martin, and their experiment was alpha particle experiment. Here we can see how did they do that experiment. According to Thomson's model, if we incident alpha particle into, for example, metal foil, those alpha particles should directly pass through that metal foil without scattering or without reflecting back. But when they did this experiment here, as we can see, they saw that those alpha particles were scattered into many directions, and some reflected back even. In this figure we can understand the result better. If it was according to Thomson model, the particles should pass through that atom in a direct line without any scattering or without any reflecting back. But the result was like Rutherford's model, as the two scientists, as a result of their experiment, they proved it. So they proved that. Let's get to the problems with Rutherford. Now we talked about before that Rutherford has two problems. One of them, he said atoms are unstable. The second one, he said he couldn't explain the atomic spectrum. Now atomic spectra, for example, around the sun there is an atmosphere which is cooler than the surface of the sun. Because of that atmosphere and the radiation from the sun emits and passes through that atmosphere, some of the electromagnetic waves in the visible color will be absorbed by the atmosphere. And this is a big picture of atomic spectra. The same atomic spectra radiation happens inside atoms, and Rutherford couldn't explain that phenomenon. There are two parts on the atomic spectra. First one is absorption spectrum, second one is emission spectrum. Experimentally, in this figure we can produce an atomic spectra in labs similar to the ones that we get from the sun. In this figure we can understand the atomic spectra better. So when we give energy to an atomic gas inside a tube, radiation will start to emit from that gas as light, and when that light passes through surface slits and passes through the prism, that light will be separated into its colors. And if we look at that color, we can see there are some black lines between those colors. Actually, those colors must be continuous. There shouldn't be any space between them. But those spaces, those black lines between those colors, shows the identity of that gas that we use inside this tube. So every gas has its own color distribution and its own black lines between them. Those black lines are the identity of that gas that we are using. Here another example for different gases in this figure. You can see, for example, hydrogen gas has very few lines, mostly black. If we saw those lines in the spectra of any gas, we can directly say it's the gas of hydrogen. Here we have another example of mercury, Hg. You can see the lines are different than hydrogen and helium. So it's always like this. Those identities does not change. That's why we can easily say which gas is which when we get those lights from the stars, for example. So scientists put simply a prism like that in the figure before, a prism glass in front of the sunlight, and on the screen, on a wall, let's say, they can see those lines. The sunlight, which we put the prism in front, and the screen will be appearing like this. Some lines are missing, and by counting those missing lines, they can easily identify that the sun is formed from what type of gases by help of those missing lines, the dark lines. Those missing lines are called as absorption spectrum. Here we talked about it. Absorption spectrum. So Rutherford couldn't explain this phenomena in his experiment or in his model. Here we have another figure that shows us absorption and emission spectrum. Emission spectrum of hydrogen and absorption spectrum of hydrogen. If you want to understand better, here another schematic of absorption spectrum. Here we have a hot source. If the radiation comes directly from that hot source, there will be a continuous spectrum like that. If we put a prism in front of that hot source light, you will see continuous spectrum if there was no any barriers between the prism and the hot source. But if there's a gas between our prism and the hot source, when the light passes through that gas, some of the lines would be absorbed. That's why it's called as absorption spectrum after the visual of the prism appears on the screen. And here we have the emission spectrum. So those results will be as at the end of the light passes through that gas. So we talked about the sun. We said the radiation that we get from the sun passes through a cooler atmosphere. Because of that cool atmosphere, which is the gas here, as we gave an example, because of that gas atmosphere, some of the lines will be missing, and those missing lines are called as absorption spectrum. Thank you for listening.